Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the bloodiest battle ever fought in the Americas, Gettysburg. This was the critical battle in the American Civil War. For 3 days, from July 1 through July 3, 1863, Americans slaughtered each other on a tremendous scale around a small town in south central Pennsylvania. When referring to the United States forces, I will either be saying the Union or Federal Army, or using the name of that particular force, which was the Army of the Potomac. And when referring to the rebel forces, I'll be either saying the Confederates or the Southerners, or that army's name, the Army of Northern Virginia. I'm not going to describe all aspects of the battle for a few reasons. Number one, describing in detail all of the movements of the various regiments or brigades of both armies would take many, many hours. Number two, I don't think it's very interesting. It's just listing a bunch of dry facts that this particular regiment or brigade went and slaughtered that particular regiment or brigade. I think the overall actions and strategy are interesting, along with some of the compelling personal stories. So those are the items I'm going to be focusing on. Let's look at some of the numbers. And before I go any further, please keep in mind that throughout this episode, that we do not have exact numbers. Different people involved in the actual battle, as well as people who have studied Gettysburg, have produced different figures. So if I state a particular statistic and you think that you've seen a different figure for the number of men involved or the number of casualties, etc., that is why. But the following are probably fairly accurate. The Union Army at Gettysburg was approximately 90,000 men. The Confederate Army had approximately 75,000 men. These numbers make it appear that the Federal forces greatly outnumbered the Southern troops. But something most people don't consider is that a lot of the men in the Union Army were involved in menial labor, like cooking, laundry, taking care of the horses. We don't know how many men of the Union Army were involved in such tasks, but we do know that the Confederate Army brought along an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 slaves who were forced to do such chores. The point is just about all of the men in the Southern Army were available to fight since they had enslaved people to do their menial work. This means that the numbers of available fighting men in the two armies were a lot closer. Most people think that the word casualties means the number of killed. Not so. The term casualties includes those who were killed, wounded, as well as missing or captured. At Gettysburg, Union casualties are estimated at just over 23,000 men, and Confederate casualties just over 28,000. The Federal forces suffered 3,155 killed, and the Southerners had approximately 3,900 dead. There were approximately 14,500 Federal troops wounded and approximately 18,700 Southerners wounded. The number of missing or captured were very close, with the Union losing approximately 5,300 and the Confederates losing approximately 5,400. Let's set the scene for the battle. The Civil War had begun in April 1861. By the beginning of the summer of 1863, things were going badly for the South. Ulysses S. Grant was conducting a siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Once Vicksburg fell, Union forces would have control over the entire Mississippi River. This would isolate Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy. In the Eastern Theater, Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were racking up victories over the Federal Army of the Potomac, but were not close to winning the war. Except for the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, which occurred near Sharpsburg, Maryland, all of the fighting for Lee's army was in Virginia. Gettysburg had the most casualties of any battle in the war, but it was spread out over 3 days. Antietam was the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. In June 1863, Robert E. Lee decided to invade the North. There is a lot of debate as to why he did this, but it seems that Lee had a few ideas in mind. Number one, get the war out of Virginia, which was heavily scarred from all of the battles. While traveling through Pennsylvania, which was untouched by the war, Lee's army confiscated a lot of supplies, including food, horses, clothing, whatever they can get their hands on. And here's a dirty little secret from Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania. The Army of Northern Virginia captured every black person that they could find and then sent them south into slavery. Number two, get the Federal Army of the Potomac out into the open ground, and maybe Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia could attack the Union forces when they were on the move and unprepared. Number three, we don't know what Lee's ultimate geographic destination was. It seemed like he would have liked to have taken the Pennsylvania state capital of Harrisburg. And some people argue that if successful capturing Harrisburg, he might have moved on to Philadelphia. But the purpose of sacking some northern towns and cities was to hopefully get the people of the North to lose their will to continue fighting this war and press the government of Abraham Lincoln to sue for peace. Some people, and I am certainly one of them, think that Lee made a serious mistake invading Pennsylvania for two reasons. Number one, with all of those battles in Virginia, Lee was used to having home field advantage. Maps were terrible in those days. The maps had very little detail on them, just broad generalities. Military leaders need to know the location of every road as well as every hill, river, and stream. But the Union generals in Virginia usually did not have any particulars about the local area. However, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia usually had soldiers who were from that area and knew where every hidden road or creek was located. And when Lee did not have somebody in the army who knew the area, the local civilians were certainly eager to help. Number two, it was so much easier being on the defensive than being the attacking army in the Civil War. In the Civil War, they had rifled guns. Rifling is a set of grooves inside the barrel, which makes a bullet spin. Another innovation, round balls shot from a musket were a thing of the past. In 1849, a French army officer named Claude Etienne Minier invented a conical-shaped projectile, which is the basic shape of bullets we are familiar with today. The rifling of the guns, combined with the conical bullet, made for long-distance accuracy. This changed warfare tactics and really gave the advantage to the defenders. I went into all of this in great detail in my episode entitled Civil War Generals Throwdown, Ulysses S. Grant versus Robert E. Lee. Besides the new technology for shooting at an enemy, the other main reason it was good to be on the defensive was that you could dig trenches and put up breastworks and shoot the attacking enemy from a relatively safe position. All right, you know that Robert E. Lee was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. But who was in command of the Army of the Potomac? The commanding officer was George Meade. But he was only in command for a few days before the battle broke out. Before Meade, the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac had been Joe Hooker. And now for some erroneous etymology. There's a myth that the term hookers started because there were so many prostitutes around Joe Hooker's command. It's not true. The term hooker as a euphemism for prostitute can be found before the Civil War. And now for a true story of word origin. Ambrose Burnside was the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac before Joe Hooker. He had big bushy whiskers on his cheeks. And according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, sideburns take their name from General Ambrose Burnside. Getting back to Joe Hooker. As the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, he got his butt kicked big time at the Battle of Chancellorsville in the beginning of May 1863. That battle is considered Robert E. Lee's masterpiece. But Chancellorsville was costly for Lee. The famed Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by one of his own men. Complications from his injuries led to his death about a week later. There are conflicting stories as to why he did so, but on June 27, 1863, Hooker tendered his resignation. It seems that Hooker was surprised when Lincoln accepted the resignation. Lincoln was happy to be rid of Joe Hooker. Lincoln never liked Hooker personally, but appointed him commander of the Army of the Potomac in January 1863 because Lincoln thought he was the best person available. Lincoln made this clear in his January 26, 1863 written message to Hooker, which included this fabulous quote. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of this, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up as dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. So you can see why Lincoln was relieved to get rid of Joe Hooker after the disaster of Chancellorsville. Supposedly, Lincoln offered the command of the Army of the Potomac to John F. Reynolds, but he turned it down. Lincoln then appointed George Meade. So Meade became the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. I've set the scene for you why Lee invaded Pennsylvania. But why did the battle take place at Gettysburg? Why not someplace else in south central Pennsylvania? The location of the fight wasn't really planned by anybody, it just happened. Lee had received information from a spy that the Army of the Potomac was marching north to meet the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's army was kind of spread out across parts of Pennsylvania. Lee ordered his army to come together. If you look at a map of Gettysburg from 1863, that's where lots of roads came together. They kind of look like spokes coming together at the hub of a wheel. Following these roads, this is where the two armies met. Robert E. Lee certainly did not pick the place. The Army of Northern Virginia was traveling blindly. That was because he did not have his cavalry. Nowadays, militaries have satellites and aircraft to scout the area and determine where the enemy forces are located. During the Civil War, there was some limited use of observation balloons, but that was rare. An army on the move generally relied on its cavalry. That meant soldiers on horseback. The cavalry would screen the infantry from enemy forces and would be in advance of the infantry to scout what was ahead. The problem for Lee was that his cavalry commander was far away. The commander of the cavalry for the Army of Northern Virginia was a man named J.E.B. Stuart. The initials stood for James Ewell Brown Stuart. But people turned his initials into essentially a first name, and everybody just called him Jeb. In the summer of 1863, Jeb Stuart was only 30 years old. He was a very capable commander, but he loved the glory and publicity. When the Army of Northern Virginia invaded Pennsylvania, Stuart and his cavalry were on a large ride all the way around the Army of the Potomac. Some people argue that Stuart was forced out of position because of the location of Union infantry and cavalry, and that's how he ended up on the east side of the Federal troops. Some argue that Stuart was on a joyride for the glory. I'm in that camp. Stuart had done this before during the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia in June 1862. That trip around the Union Army made Stuart a household name and made the Army of the Potomac look very foolish. So in late June and early July 1863, instead of doing his job in scouting for and screening the Army of Northern Virginia, Stuart was taking his cavalry around the Army of the Potomac. The Southern cavalry captured a lot of wagons with supplies from the Union Army. It's true that those supplies were desperately needed by the Confederates, but the supplies were not nearly as valuable as having accurate information of the enemy's movements. Jeb Stuart and his cavalry did not show up in Gettysburg until the second day of the fighting, July 2. By this point, Lee already knew where the Union Army was located, directly in front of him. First, let me describe a little the geography. I just measured on Google Maps. The town of Gettysburg is less than 8 miles, or less than 13 kilometers, from Maryland. By the way, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland is the famous Mason-Dixon line. In the 1800s, that border was considered the dividing line between North and South, since Pennsylvania was a free state and Maryland was a slave state. It was called the Mason-Dixon line because those were the names of the two men who surveyed the straight line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And this is probably where the name Dixie came from for the South. Everything south of the Mason-Dixon line was referred to as Dixie. There's another theory that the name Dixie originated from $10 bills issued by banks in Louisiana before the Civil War. In those days, banks issued their own banknotes, meaning paper money. The Citizens Bank of Louisiana, based in New Orleans, issued $10 banknotes which had the word DIX on the back. For those of you who speak French, you recognize that that's the word 10, the French word for 10. But English-speaking people pronounced that word as dix and started to call those banknotes Dixies, and then started calling people in Louisiana Dixies, and eventually all Southerners Dixies. Who knows? In reality, we're not sure where the name Dixie comes from. Anyway, getting back to the topic at hand. Most of the fighting occurred just south of the town of Gettysburg. The Confederate forces were lined up generally on a north-south line, essentially centered on Seminary Ridge. Now, here's where it gets confusing, because the Union troops were essentially lined up on a north-south line facing the Confederate troops on Cemetery Ridge. The fact that the names Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge are so close leads a lot of people to mix them up. The Federal troops spent most of the battle in a defensive line shaped like an upside-down fishhook. The Union line started at Culp's Hill, that's spelled C-U-L-P'-S, Hill. If that formation was a fishhook, that would be the pointy end of the hook. Then it curved around Cemetery Hill, and then it made a fairly straight line to the south along Cemetery Ridge down to a hill known as Little Round Top. And just past there was a larger hill known as Big Round Top, but it did not play as significant of a role in the battle as Little Round Top, which I will describe in detail later. I just looked it up. According to Google Maps, the distance from Cemetery Hill, the northern part of the Union line, to Little Round Top, the southern part of the Union line, is 2.1 miles or 3.4 kilometers. Of course, the actual battle line would be longer because it curved around. It was not a straight line. The Battle of Gettysburg lasted for 3 days. Day 1 was on Wednesday, July 1. General John Buford was leading some Union cavalry when he saw the Confederates approaching Gettysburg. Buford looked around at the terrain and realized that there were good defensive positions and he should defend this place. First and foremost, an army likes to have the high ground. This is important because you can see farther, and any attacking force has to come uphill, which is tiring, and it is a better vantage point for shooting rifles as well as cannons. Buford saw that there was plenty of high ground where the Army of the Potomac could be deployed. And also, there was plenty of open ground between these hills and ridges and the direction where the Confederates would be coming from. Soldiers like to have open ground so they can see the army that's coming to attack them, so it's easier to shoot at the enemy. The fighting began in the morning of July 1. The Union cavalry was fighting dismounted. This means that they were off of their horses and fighting on foot. The vast majority of soldiers in the Civil War had single-shot, muzzle-loading muskets. You've probably seen this in the movies where they load the gunpowder and the bullet from the end of the barrel and push it down with the ramrod. It took approximately 15 to 20 seconds to reload a musket and fire it. The goal of an army was to have a soldier get off 3 shots per minute. When you read about Gettysburg, a lot of people claim that Buford's cavalry had Spencer repeating rifles. They probably did not. By the way, you see Spencers referred sometimes as rifles and sometimes as carbines. Spencers were built in both forms. The difference between a carbine and a rifle is a carbine has a shorter barrel. Anyway, the Spencer repeating rifle was a marvel. It was developed by a young guy named Christopher Spencer, who patented his repeating rifle in 1860. Instead of muzzle loading like the muskets that most Civil War soldiers used, the Spencer rifle used cartridge bullets. You did not have to load gunpowder and then a separate bullet. The cartridge contained the gunpowder and the bullet. And best of all, the soldier could put 7 of these cartridges into the magazine located in the butt of the rifle. By cocking the mechanism, the expended shell would be ejected and the next bullet would be inserted. In short, this meant that a soldier could get off 7 shots very quickly. With this incredible advance in technology, you have to ask, why didn't all of the Union soldiers have Spencer repeating rifles? The answer was money. A standard musket cost approximately $18, but a Spencer repeating rifle cost approximately $43. When you are arming millions of men, that price difference really adds up, and that's why the War Department went for the muzzle-loading muskets. Things began to change when Spencer provided a demonstration to the Commander-in-Chief. On August 17 or 18, 1863, Spencer went to the White House for an appointment with Abraham Lincoln himself. Lincoln fired the Spencer repeating rifle and was greatly impressed. He told the War Department that he wanted them for the Union Army. I've read conflicting dates for when this demonstration occurred with Lincoln, but August of 1863 appears to be the correct time. This date is significant because it was after the Battle of Gettysburg. The Confederacy never had a repeating rifle except for those that they confiscated from Union soldiers, but those were few and far between. Getting back to today's topic of Gettysburg, I have seen conflicting dates for when Spencer rifles began to be distributed to Union forces. But from what I've read, there may have been some isolated units of the Union Army who had Spencers before Gettysburg, but the wide distribution of Spencer repeating rifles started in the autumn of 1863, which of course was after the Battle of Gettysburg. Supposedly, the United States Navy had purchased a few hundred Spencer repeating rifles at the beginning of the war. I could not find any definitive statistics, but it appears that by the end of the Civil War, most Union cavalry outfits had either Spencer or Henry repeating rifles, and some infantry units also had a type of repeating rifle. In short, there are conflicting accounts as to whether or not there were any Spencer repeating rifles used by Union forces at Gettysburg. As Buford's troopers were trying to slow down the advance of the Confederates, Buford sent a message to the general in command of the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac, John Reynolds. You might recall earlier I said that Lincoln had offered Reynolds command of the entire Army of the Potomac, but he had turned it down, and that's how Meade became the commanding officer. Reynolds rushed his 1st Corps to Gettysburg and set up defensive positions. Unfortunately, Reynolds was killed that very day. You hear that term corps. It's spelled C-O-R-P-S. What did that mean? It's how the Army was organized. Each army was broken down into smaller units called corps. And then each corps was made up of divisions. And then each division was broken down into brigades. And the brigades were broken down into smaller units called regiments. And regiments were made up of companies. Most of the fighting that first day occurred north and west of the town of Gettysburg. Eventually, the Confederates drove the Union forces back through Gettysburg. The Federal Army retreated to their defensive position on and around Cemetery Hill. Lee arrived at Gettysburg late in the day. He saw that the Federal forces were digging in on top of Cemetery Hill. Lee ordered General Richard Ewell to take that hill if practicable. This has become one of the most famous phrases from the Civil War. In everyday life, you don't hear that word practicable very often. Richard Ewell decided that it was not practicable or feasible to take the hill. Ever since, there's been a lot of argument about this. The fans of Stonewall Jackson say that if he was alive and present, he would have taken the hill. Who knows? Ewell might have been right to think he could not take Cemetery Hill. The Federals were in a good defensive position, and the Southerners were exhausted after a long day of marching and fighting. In any event, the fighting on the first day ended. The Union troops spent the night from July 1 to July 2 fortifying their positions on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill and down along Cemetery Ridge. And now it's time to discuss the Confederate General James Longstreet. Longstreet was born in 1821 in South Carolina. He attended West Point, and in case you are not familiar with West Point, that is the name of the United States Military Academy. We know that Longstreet was good friends with Ulysses S. Grant before the war. I have read that Longstreet was Grant's best man when Grant married Julia Dent in 1848 in St. Louis. This story pops up in a lot of places, but I don't think it's true. They knew each other from their time at West Point. Longstreet graduated from West Point in 1842, and Grant graduated the following year. After graduation, they were both stationed near St. Louis, and they fought together in the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. Okay, they were definitely buddies, but did Longstreet act as best man at Grant's wedding? It appears that this claim first appeared in print in a book from 1905 entitled Recollections of a Confederate Staff Officer. It was written by former Confederate General Gilbert Moxley Sorrell, who was on Longstreet's staff during the Civil War. In the book, there's just a passing reference where Sorrell states, "At West Point, he," meaning Longstreet, "was fast friends with Grant and was the best man at the latter's marriage." Here is why this claim is doubtful. The book came out 57 years after the marriage, and the author, Gilbert Moxley Sorrell, wasn't at the marriage. It's unclear where he got this information. And when the book came out in 1905, Longstreet, Grant, and Julia Grant were all dead. So none of the three principal parties were around to confirm or deny the claim. I have a copy of Grant's personal memoirs published in 1885, 20 years after the Civil War. As far as I could tell, the only reference he has to his marriage is in chapter 14, wherein he states, "I obtained a leave of absence for 4 months and proceeded to St. Louis. On the 22nd of August, 1848, I was married to Miss Julia Dent, the lady of whom I have before spoken." He doesn't say anything about Longstreet. If the story were true, you would think he would have mentioned that one of the most famous Confederate generals had been his best man. And probably most telling of all was an article in the New York Times dated July 24, 1885. This was the day after Grant died of cancer. In that New York Times article, Longstreet stated to the reporter, "In 1848, after the usual uncertainties of a soldier's courtship, Grant returned and claimed Miss Dent as a bride. I had been married just 6 months at the time, and my wife and I were among the guests at the wedding." I find it amazing that I could look up a New York Times article from 1885 by just having an online subscription. Anyway, you would think that if he was the best man at the wedding, Longstreet would have mentioned this fact to the New York Times. So, it's possible that Longstreet was Grant's best man at the wedding, but doubtful. I only go into this in such detail because sometimes a false claim is made and it gets repeated over and over and people accept it as a fact. Getting back to Longstreet, by the second year of the Civil War, he became Robert E. Lee's second in command in the Army of Northern Virginia. In an extremely sad personal note, during the Civil War in 1862, Longstreet lost 3 children to scarlet fever. I don't know how anybody could deal with such a tremendous loss and continue to function, but amazingly, he was Lee's best general. I know Stonewall Jackson gets more hype, but in my opinion, Longstreet was better. Getting back to the narrative, it's unclear when Longstreet had his big discussion with Robert E. Lee about not fighting at Gettysburg. I've read conflicting accounts as to whether this occurred on the evening of July 1 or the evening of July 2, or possibly on both occasions. At some point after the fighting was done on July 1, Longstreet spoke to Robert E. Lee and tried to convince Lee that it would be much better for the Army of Northern Virginia to withdraw from this area around Gettysburg. Longstreet told Lee that they should move to the south of the Federal position and find good defensive ground. And by that, he meant like the good defensive ground that the Army of the Potomac was currently occupying. Longstreet's plan was to find a strong defensive position that was between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, D.C. With the threat to the national capital, the Union Army would have to attack the Southern Army in a position of Lee's choosing. Lee heard him out but said no. Supposedly, Lee pointed at Cemetery Ridge and said that the enemy is there and I will fight him there. The second day of the Battle of Gettysburg was Thursday, July 2, 1863. The Union Army was essentially dug into its defensive position that I described earlier as an upside-down fishhook. This went from Culp's Hill at the northeast end of the fishhook to Cemetery Hill, just west of Culp's Hill, and then south down Cemetery Ridge down towards Little Round Top. Lee's plan was to attack the Union Army on both flanks, meaning attack the Union Army at each end. In the military, they talk about their right and their left. It means which way that particular army was facing. So the Union right would be Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. From the Confederate position when attacking, that would be the left of Lee's army. Lee wanted to attack the Union's right and left flanks. Let's start with the Federal right flank. The assault on the Union right did not start until late in the day on July 2. The Confederates attacked Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, but the Union troops had been digging in all night and all morning. They had dug trenches and put up barricades of stone and fence rails and anything else they could find for protection. When you are in a firefight, it is much better to be behind any kind of breastwork or in a trench. There was a lot of fighting and a lot of casualties on both sides, but the Confederates were not able to drive the Federal troops off of Culp's Hill or Cemetery Hill. The Southern attack on the Union right was a failure. What about the attack on the Union left? Commanding General of the Union Army, George Meade, thought he had a strong position on the high ground along Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. But Daniel Sickles was about to change that. Sickles was in command of the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Much to the surprise of Commanding General Meade, as well as to the Confederates, Sickles moved the 3rd Corps off of Cemetery Ridge. He moved his corps in front of the rest of the Union Army and set up in an area which has come to be known in history as the Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, and the Wheat Field. Obviously, the terms Peach Orchard and Wheat Field are self-explanatory. But what was the Devil's Den? It's a hill in front of Little Round Top, which is covered with huge boulders. There has been a debate about this move by Dan Sickles from 1863 to the present. Sickles claimed that he had authority to do this, but that does not appear to be the case. Before I go into how this impacted the battle, let's discuss Dan Sickles. In the late 1850s, Daniel Sickles was a congressman from New York City. In the Civil War, he served as a major general in the Union Army. Philip Barton Key was famous in his own right as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, but Philip Barton Key is most famous because he was the son of Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, America's national anthem. What linked these two men together was when, on February 27, 1859, Congressman Daniel Sickles made national headlines when he murdered Philip Barton Key. Why did he do it? Well, it's because Key was having an affair with the wife of Dan Sickles, Teresa. Sickles shot Key 3 times in the middle of Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. That's the square directly across from the main entrance to the White House. Sickles was immediately arrested. His case made legal history because it was the first successful use of the temporary insanity defense in the United States. And who was the brilliant defense attorney for Dan Sickles? Edwin Stanton, who later was the Secretary of War during most of the Civil War. So even though Sickles admitted that he shot Philip Barton Key, who was unarmed by the way, Sickles was acquitted on the defense of temporary insanity. And here's the kicker. After the trial, Dan Sickles and Teresa got back together. The fact that they reunited was considered very scandalous. Dan Sickles became a pariah in political circles in the U.S. until 2 things occurred. Number 1, he lost his right leg on the 2nd day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Number 2, Teresa died in 1867 of tuberculosis. By the way, Dan Sickles remarried a few years later. That amputated right leg from Dan Sickles was sent to a museum with a card attached that said, "With the compliments of Major General D.E.S., United States Volunteers." Obviously, DES was Daniel E. Sickles. The remains of the amputated right leg of Dan Sickles are located at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. Getting back to the fighting of July 2, what upset Meade so much about Sickles moving his corps forward was that it broke the Union line. An army is much stronger if all of the units are lined up so they are near each other and can support each other. The big fear of Civil War generals was to have an exposed flank. What do we mean by that? Think of it this way. If an army is all lined up, essentially in a straight line, and facing one direction, it is ready to defend itself when it is being attacked from the direction it is facing. But what if the enemy comes around to the flank, meaning the side, and attacks from there? Picture a straight line going up and down, representing the blue army. Now the gray army attacks by crossing that straight line like a capital letter T. The soldiers of the blue army are all looking one direction when they get hit from the side. This was often a goal of an attacking army in the Civil War. If you could attack the army's flank, they would be exposed, and the attacking forces would roll up the defending soldiers who are both looking the wrong way and are greatly outnumbered at the point of attack. By moving his 3rd Corps forward from the good defensive position along Cemetery Ridge, Sickles exposed the right and left flanks of the 3rd Corps. He also left a giant gap in the Federals' defensive line up on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate forces under James Longstreet attacked these exposed Union troops in the Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, and the Wheat Field. The result was a slaughter of thousands of men in that part of the Gettysburg battlefield. After so much death and carnage on both sides, the Southerners failed to achieve their objective of routing the Federal Army and gaining an outright Confederate victory. At the end of the day, there were bodies everywhere throughout the Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, and the Wheat Field. As the fighting proceeded in that part of the field on July 2, some officers on both sides realized that Little Round Top was undefended. Both the Confederates and the Federals realized that this was a commanding position and needed to get troops up there. On the Union side, messengers were sent to find troops that were available to occupy Little Round Top. Fortunately for the Union, one of the Federal couriers ran into Colonel Strong Vincent, commander of the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division of the 5th Corps. And no, I am not saying his name backwards. Strong was his first name and Vincent was his last name. That's a very cool first name for a Civil War officer, Strong. He was a young guy to be in command of a brigade. He had just turned 26 years old on June 17 of that year. As soon as he received word that the high command wanted that hill occupied, Colonel Vincent decisively and quickly moved his brigade to the crest of Little Round Top. Vincent's brigade had 4 regiments: the 44th New York, 16th Michigan, 83rd Pennsylvania, and the 20th Maine. Vincent located his 4 regiments in good defensive positions on top of Little Round Top. The regiment, which was placed on the extreme left, was the 20th Maine, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Chamberlain was born on September 8, 1828, near Bangor, Maine. He went by his middle name of Lawrence. In 1852, he graduated from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. Chamberlain went back to Bowdoin to teach languages and rhetoric, meaning persuasive speaking and writing. Bowdoin has had lots of famous alumni, including the author Nathaniel Hawthorne and President Franklin Pierce. Although Pierce is one of the worst presidents in American history. When the Civil War came, Chamberlain asked for leave from Bowdoin College so he could join the Army. This request was denied. So, Chamberlain asked for a sabbatical, supposedly for him to study abroad. When this request was granted, Chamberlain joined the U.S. Army. In July of 1863, Chamberlain was a colonel in command of the 20th Maine Regiment. Why was it called the 20th Maine? During the Civil War, both sides raised regiments locally. So the 1st regiment from a particular state would be known as the 1st Connecticut or the 1st North Carolina, etc. When Colonel Vincent showed Chamberlain where the 20th Maine was to be located, he explained to Chamberlain that this was the extreme end of the Army of the Potomac. He told Chamberlain, "You cannot leave this position. There is no retreat allowed, no matter what." Can you imagine being given those orders? It's not that an officer is immediately thinking of retreating, but you certainly like to know that it's an option if you are being overrun by an attacking enemy. The 20th Maine and the other regiments of their brigade were not on Little Round Top very long before the Confederate forces started to attack. During the fighting on Little Round Top, Colonel Strong Vincent was shot. He was carried from the field to a nearby farmhouse but died 5 days later on July 7, 1863. Today, you can find a monument for Strong Vincent on Little Round Top. On the monument, he is listed as General Strong Vincent. When I first saw this, I thought they had made a mistake listing him as a general instead of a colonel. But no, the monument is correct. During the evening of July 2, 1863, when the fighting for that day had ended, the commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac, Major General George Meade, promoted Strong Vincent to Brigadier General. I personally love the instant communications of today with texting, email, or phone calls. But something has been lost when people stopped writing letters. When the Union Army was marching towards Gettysburg, Strong Vincent sent a letter to his pregnant wife. In that letter, he told her, "If I fall, remember you have given your husband to the most righteous cause that ever widowed a woman." You just don't find something that moving in a text or an email. Getting back to the battle on Little Round Top, it was certainly an advantage to have the high ground. The Southern soldiers had to run uphill to attack the Federal forces. The Confederates were attacking all of the Union regiments on top of Little Round Top, but the fighting seemed to be the heaviest at the extreme left flank, which was manned by the 20th Maine. Each time the Confederates attacked, the men from the 20th Maine drove them back. After a lot of very fierce fighting, the Federal soldiers were exhausted and most were out of ammunition. Only a few people had any bullets left. So put yourself in the position of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. You were told that you could not retreat from your position or it might lead to the rolling up of the entire left flank and a Confederate victory. But you also couldn't defend yourself anymore because you were out of bullets. Chamberlain thought about it and decided his only option was a bayonet charge. Bayonet charges were very big up through the time of Napoleon, but there were not a lot of them in the Civil War. That's because rifles had become so accurate for such greater distances. Chamberlain ordered his men to fix bayonets. That means you attached your bayonet, which is like a giant knife, to the end of your rifle. When they heard the Confederates coming back up the hill, Chamberlain gave the order to charge. It was a tremendous success for the 20th Maine. The men from Maine had the advantage of running downhill. And you have to remember that the Southern soldiers were exhausted by this time also. The 20th Maine captured a lot of Confederate soldiers and secured the extreme left flank of the Union line. Day 3 of the Battle of Gettysburg occurred on Friday, July 3. It started with another Confederate attack on the Union right flank at Culp's Hill. The short version is that after hours of fighting on Culp's Hill, the Union forces held. The Confederate attack achieved nothing except for a lot of casualties on both sides. But the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg is renowned for the most famous frontal assault of the Civil War, known as Pickett's Charge. It was named after General George Pickett of Virginia. Lee explained to Longstreet that the Southerners had attacked both flanks of the Union line and failed. George Meade had to have sent troops to both his right and left flanks to counter these Confederate assaults. Because of this, Lee reasoned that the center must be the most vulnerable spot of the Union line. Lee was hoping to hit the Army of the Potomac at its supposed weak point in the center of its line along Cemetery Ridge. He told Longstreet to assign the lead of the attack to George Pickett's division, since it had arrived late at Gettysburg and had not been involved in any fighting. Essentially, Pickett's division would be fresh. Lee assigned 2 other divisions to Longstreet's command for this assault. Those were the divisions of General J. Johnston Pettigrew and General Isaac Trimble. So there were 3 divisions involved, commanded by Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. But for some reason, history remembers the assault as Pickett's Charge. Lee told Longstreet that the rallying point would be this copse of trees in the middle of Cemetery Ridge that were behind a low stone wall. Except for reading about the Battle of Gettysburg, I've never heard that word copse. It's spelled C-O-P-S-E, and it means a small group of trees. Near that copse of trees, there was a stone wall that made 2 90-degree angles. The stone wall ran along the top of Cemetery Ridge, but near this copse of trees, it jutted out towards the direction from which the Confederates would come, and then there was another 90-degree angle to send the stone wall in the same direction it was already going along the top of Cemetery Ridge. Essentially like a letter Z with 90-degree angles. It became famous as the Angle for reasons I'll explain in a little bit. The men of Pickett's Charge would have to march across an open field approximately 3/4 of a mile or 1.2 kilometers. These men would have to walk that distance while the Federal guns, meaning cannons, would be devastating them. When you see these depictions of these men walking, you wonder, why don't they just run? Well, you can't run until you get close because you don't want all of your troops to be exhausted when they reach the Union line. It was a very hot day, and we have specific information thanks to a guy named Dr. Michael Jacobs, a professor at Pennsylvania College located at Gettysburg. According to the school's website, Pennsylvania College became Gettysburg College in 1921. Dr. Jacobs realized that he was witnessing history and took extensive notes during the 3 days of the battle, including the weather. According to Dr. Jacobs, it was 87 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be 30.5 degrees Celsius. Imagine fighting in such heat and presumably humidity, since it was Pennsylvania in the summertime. And the soldiers were not wearing the most comfortable uniforms. Union soldiers had wool uniforms. Southern uniforms were not really standardized, but they had a combination of wool and cotton. All of these uniforms were heavy and could not have been very comfortable on such a hot day. So if the officers had their men run across that whole open distance, carrying a rifle and ammunition, they would have been exhausted by the time they reached the crest of Cemetery Ridge to fight the Union soldiers. Before the assault began, Lee ordered a massive artillery bombardment of the center of the Union line. We're not sure how many guns were involved. And remember, in the Civil War, when they said guns, they meant cannons, artillery. I've seen different figures of the number of guns involved, but they're all between 140 and 172. And it appears that possibly 56 of those guns were not used in the bombardment, although I'm not sure why. The Confederate artillery barrage on Cemetery Hill was conducted by Colonel Edward Porter Alexander. Most people rate Alexander as probably the best artilleryman that the Confederacy had, even though he was only 28 years old at the time of the Gettysburg battle. The Confederate artillery opened fire at approximately 1 o'clock p.m. There are disputes about how long the Southern bombardment lasted, but it was at least an hour. The Federal artillery shot back at the Confederate lines for a while, but then stopped. Orders were given to save their ammunition for the infantry assault, which was obviously coming soon. When Porter's guns were just about out of ammunition, he sent word to Pickett that if he was going to attack, it better be now. When Lee had told Longstreet about his plans for the assault on the center of the Union line, Lee had supposedly promised Longstreet 15,000 men for the attack. Longstreet said that he had been a career-long soldier, and it was his opinion that 15,000 men could not possibly take that defensive position. But Lee was the commander and overruled him. Now when Pickett asked him if he could start the assault, Longstreet could not bring himself to give the order for what he believed to be a grave mistake which would simply cost thousands of lives. Longstreet knew it was a terrible mistake and couldn't talk. Finally, he just nodded to Pickett, and Pickett ran off excitedly to give the orders to the men for the charge, which would forever bear his name. Although Lee supposedly promised Longstreet about 15,000 men for the attack, it seems that there were actually less soldiers involved. I've read different numbers as to how many men were involved in the assault of July 3, known as Pickett's Charge, but it seems to be somewhere between 12,500 and 13,000 Confederate soldiers. The Confederate troops marched out from the woods to begin their attack somewhere between 2 o'clock p.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Besides marching the approximately 3/4 of a mile or 1.2 kilometers of open field, the Southern soldiers also had to climb over split rail fences along the Emmitsburg Road. The Emmitsburg Road ran directly across the path of the Confederate soldiers. It's not hard to climb over such a fence in normal conditions, but it meant that the soldiers had to stop to climb over it while they were being shelled by the Union artillery. The attackers greatly outnumbered the defenders in this location. Holding this position in the center of the Union line were approximately 5,000 men commanded by General Winfield Scott Hancock. And again, the numbers of men, guns, casualties, and distances are all somewhat in dispute. But the figures I'm giving you are what seem to me to be the most accurate. Very few of the attacking soldiers made it up to the low stone wall where the Union soldiers were waiting. We don't know how many Confederate soldiers made it to that stone wall. The best estimate that I could find would be approximately 250 actually breached the stone wall before being eventually pushed back. That situation is often referred to as the high watermark of the Confederacy. The Southern soldiers that breached the stone wall at the angle that I told you about earlier were led by Confederate General Lewis Armistead. Before the war, Armistead and Hancock had been best friends. People described the two as being as close as brothers. They chose different sides when the war broke out, and they both hoped that they would never face each other on a battlefield. But here they were. Hancock was wounded during this Confederate assault, but he refused to leave the field. When Armistead led his men over the wall at the angle, they were eventually pushed back. Armistead was mortally wounded. While he lay dying, he was attended by some Union soldiers. Armistead asked if Hancock was okay, and they told him that he had been shot. Armistead asked the Union soldiers to tell his friend Hancock that he was sorry. Historians have wondered all these years what Armistead meant. Did he mean that he was sorry Hancock was injured? Did he mean he was sorry that he led the attack on Hancock's position? Or did he mean that he was sorry that he fought for the Confederacy? We will never know. Armistead died 2 days later in a Union Army field hospital. Hancock recovered and had a pretty amazing career. Winfield Scott Hancock was in charge of the July 7, 1865 execution of the 4 conspirators who were convicted in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Hancock was even the Democratic nominee for president in 1880. He lost that election to another veteran Civil War general, the Republican nominee, James Garfield. Unfortunately, Garfield had the second shortest term in office when he was shot on July 2, 1881, and eventually died on September 19, 1881. He served only 199 days in office. Of course, the shortest term was President William Henry Harrison, who died 31 days after he was inaugurated in 1841. Anyway, getting back to Pickett's charge, we don't have exact figures, but over one half of the men in Pickett's charge were lost in that attack, killed, wounded, or captured. As the remnants of the Confederate troops were returning to the positions where they had started, Lee told Pickett to organize his division for a possible counterattack by the Federal forces. George Pickett famously replied to Lee, "General, I have no division now." William Faulkner was a famous American author. One of his most well-known novels was called Intruder in the Dust, published in 1948. In that book, Faulkner wrote about the promise of Southern victory on the afternoon of July 3, 1863, just before Pickett's charge. He wrote, "For every Southern boy 14 years old, not once but whenever he wants it, there is the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence. The guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out, and Pickett himself, with his long oiled ringlets and his hat in one hand, probably, and his sword in the other, looking up the hill, waiting for Longstreet to give the word, and it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun yet. It not only hasn't begun yet, but there is still time for it not to begin against that position and those circumstances." I find it strange that any Southerners would look longingly at the possibility of a Confederate victory. Why would any Southerner want that? An independent Confederacy based upon slavery would have been a pariah among nations. By that time, the world at large was turning away from the horrors of slavery. And despite any claims to the contrary that it wasn't so bad, slavery in the United States was a system built upon terror, violence, and murder. And besides all of the moral questions, slavery was also economically a bad system. The Confederate States of America would have been a very poor country based almost entirely on agriculture. By hoarding most of the capital in the hands of the elite planter class, there would not be money dispersed throughout the Confederate economy to develop industry and inventions like what was occurring in the northern states and in Western Europe. And lastly, a Southern victory would have been such a loss for all Americans and anybody in the world who cherishes government based upon democracy. In the early 1860s, the U.S. was an outlier with a democratic form of government. In his December 1, 1862 address to Congress, Lincoln explained what was at stake when he said, "We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." So what happened after the 3-day slaughter at Gettysburg? Once Lee realized that Meade was not going to launch a counterattack on July 4, he ordered his army back to Virginia. This was a complicated procedure. There were thousands of wounded men who had to be transported in wagons over rough country roads. There were no shock absorbers in those days. These wounded men were bounced around in these wooden wagons, which greatly added to their agony. And it was tough to move tens of thousands of men along with all of their equipment and supplies. And when they got to the Potomac River, it was in flood because of recent heavy rains. This meant that they could not cross at the ford where they were planning. In case you're not familiar with that term, a ford is a shallow place in a river where people or animals or even vehicles can cross. The water was too deep and they needed to wait for the river to subside. This meant that the Army of Northern Virginia was vulnerable. Lincoln was alarmed when he read Meade's message to the Army of the Potomac congratulating them for their victory at Gettysburg. That message closed with Meade saying that he now looked to the Army for greater efforts to drive from our soil every vestige of the presence of the invader. Reading this message, Lincoln got angry. He said to his private secretary, John Hay, "Will our generals never get that idea out of their heads? The whole country is our soil." Lincoln was amazed that some of his generals could not comprehend that one of the main points of the war was that the entire country was our soil. Not only Pennsylvania, but Virginia and the rest of the South. Once it became clear to Lincoln that Meade was not pursuing the Confederate Army, Lincoln sent an order to Meade. Unfortunately, we do not have a written copy of that order. But according to Lincoln's adult son, Robert, Lincoln had General Herman Haupt hand deliver a written order from Lincoln to Meade, directing him to attack Lee's army with all his force immediately, and that if he was successful in the attack, he might destroy the order, but if he was unsuccessful, he might preserve it for his vindication. Think about what Lincoln was saying to Meade. If things go badly, I will take all the blame. But if you are successful, you can have all the credit. How many politicians then or now would ever do such a thing because it was for the good of the country? Meade finally moved the Army of the Potomac towards its namesake river. But on the night of July 13 to 14, 10 days after the Battle of Gettysburg ended, Lee got his army across the Potomac. On July 14, 1863, Meade reported to Lincoln that Lee's army was now back in Virginia. It was true that the Army of the Potomac had received tremendous losses in the 3 days of battle, but this was a chance to possibly end the war and possibly save hundreds of thousands of casualties. On July 4, 1863, the town of Vicksburg, Mississippi surrendered to federal forces led by Ulysses S. Grant. This meant that the Union now controlled all of the Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico, and the Confederacy was split into two parts. It was Lincoln's belief that, with the fall of Vicksburg, if Meade could have destroyed Lee's army before they got back to Virginia, that the war probably would be over. But the opportunity was lost. On July 14, 1863, Lincoln wrote a letter to General George Meade, which included the following. "Again, my dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. If you could not safely attack Lee last Monday, how can you possibly do so south of the river when you can take with you very few more than 2/3 of the force you then had in hand? It would be unreasonable to expect, and I do not expect, you can now effect much. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it." Lincoln never sent the letter to Meade. Lincoln sometimes did this as a coping mechanism where he would write out his feelings and then not send the letter to the addressee. The war would drag on for almost 2 more years until Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant's forces on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse. Fun fact, Appomattox Courthouse was not a building, but the name of a town. The surrender occurred in a private residence owned by a man named Wilmer McLean. As explained on the National Park Service website, in Virginia, many of the towns which were county seats were called courthouse. That's why courthouse in this instance is 2 words, because it was referring to a town. When referring to a building known as a courthouse, where I often worked during my 31 years as an attorney, courthouse is 1 word. What happened to some of those involved in the battle? Robert E. Lee was offered several jobs where he probably didn't have to do anything other than lend his name, which carried such weight in the South. Finally, he accepted a position at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. Lee died of natural causes on October 12, 1870, at the age of 63. In 1870, the faculty called for the name of the school to be changed. Washington College is now known as Washington and Lee University. University. George Pickett never got over what happened at Gettysburg. He was one of the few Confederates that ever found fault with Robert E. Lee. Pickett purportedly said about Lee, "That old man destroyed my division." For the remainder of his life, reporters and authors would ask Pickett why his charge at Gettysburg failed. Supposedly, his usual response was, "I've always thought the Yankees had something to do with it." James Longstreet became the most controversial military leader on either side of the Civil War. He had been completely committed to the Confederate cause, including slavery, but after the war, he essentially switched sides and became a champion of Reconstruction. He even became a Republican. You have to remember that at that time, Republicans were essentially just a northern political party. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. After the war, most Republicans in the South were either black or displaced Northerners, along with a few outliers like James Longstreet. Longstreet was so committed to Reconstruction that he even fought for civil rights for blacks in the post-war South. Think about it. This was the guy who was the number 2 man in the Confederate Army. And here he was fighting for civil rights. It's amazing. Longstreet was very impressed by Grant's very lenient surrender terms given to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. This was one of the reasons why Longstreet thought it was time to move on. Longstreet stated his position in an 1867 letter wherein he stated, "Yes, let's give the Republican Party a chance. Try to make this work. We appeal to arms and the sword to arbitrate the political conflict with the North. They won. Now it requires me to try to make the best of it." There was a famous incident on September 14, 1874 in New Orleans. A white supremacist mob tried to take over the city and put an end to Reconstruction. Longstreet led the forces, which included blacks as well as whites, which opposed the white supremacist mob. Unfortunately, the white supremacist mob took over the city for 3 days, and Longstreet was wounded in the so-called Battle of Liberty Place. President Grant sent federal troops who restored order in New Orleans. After the war, Longstreet and Grant became fast friends again. When Grant was president, he appointed Longstreet as the U.S. minister to the Ottoman Empire. In those days, a minister was what we now call an ambassador. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had a stellar career in the U.S. Army. He was promoted to general. He was seriously injured during the siege of Petersburg, Virginia, but he fully recovered after a long stay in the hospital. Chamberlain was present at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, and Chamberlain was given the honor to receive the Confederate surrender of arms. General Chamberlain ordered his men to attention as the Confederates passed as a sign of respect for their defeated foe. Chamberlain's career after leaving the Army was just as incredible. He was elected as the governor of Maine 4 times. Afterwards, he became the president of Bowdoin College. I'm not sure why it took so long, but in 1893, Chamberlain received the Medal of Honor for his heroism at Gettysburg. Chamberlain died on February 24, 1914, at the age of 85. According to the U.S. Department of Defense website, his death was attributed to the wounds he suffered during the siege of Petersburg, making him the last Civil War veteran to die of war-related wounds. 4 months after the giant clash, part of the Gettysburg battlefield was made into a cemetery and a ceremony was held on November 19, 1863. The main speaker was former Senator and Governor of Massachusetts, Edward Everett, who spoke for over 2 hours. Lincoln had been invited to deliver a few appropriate remarks to dedicate the cemetery. Since Lincoln's speech was so short, around 2 minutes, there is no photograph of him giving the speech. In those days, it took a long time for a photographer to get ready. By the time the photographer at Gettysburg was ready, Lincoln had finished his speech and was in the process of sitting down. That's why the only photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg is a blurry picture of him starting to sit down. Contrary to the myth, Lincoln did not write the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on the train on the way to Gettysburg. Lincoln was very meticulous about his speeches. There are 5 known copies of the Gettysburg Address, and all are in Lincoln's handwriting. 2 of the copies were written before he gave the speech, and 1 was the copy from which he read at Gettysburg. They are very legible and were clearly not written on a train. Trains in 1863 were extremely bumpy, and it would be tough to write a clear and legible copy. Those 2 copies were given to Lincoln's private secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay. Lincoln hand wrote out 3 additional copies after he gave the speech to people who had requested them. All 5 handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address have slight differences in the wording. The website, Abraham Lincoln Online, describes what is known as the Bliss copy. This version has been the most often reproduced, notably on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. It is named after Colonel Alexander Bliss, stepson of historian George Bancroft. Bancroft asked President Lincoln for a copy to use as a fundraiser for soldiers. However, because Lincoln wrote on both sides of the paper, the speech could not be reprinted, so Lincoln made another copy at Bliss's request. It is the last known copy written by Lincoln and the only one signed and dated by him. Today, it is on display at the Lincoln Room of the White House. This is the version memorized by so many American school kids. It deserves its reputation as one of the greatest speeches in the history of the English language. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Reviews really help. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. If you're listening on Spotify or any other podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.